I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. A new study says the flow of illegal immigrants to the U.S. is way down, but the get tough anti-immigration rhetoric is up. Will the tear gassing of migrants by our border agents last weekend change the debate in any way? We'll talk about it. It's gift-giving season, and books about New York are always nice to give or receive. You'll meet the author of a mammoth and beautiful new book about the city. Later on, I'll have some additional thoughts on Coda. But we begin with Mayor Bill de Blasio. It looked like November was going to be a good month for the mayor. Election day gave the Democrats control of the state Senate, which should bode well for the city. And the mayor worked hand in hand with his frequent sparring partner, Governor Cuomo, to beat out dozens of other cities and bring Amazon's HQ2 to Long Island City. But triumph quickly turned to Surus after some elected officials and community groups blasted the lucrative deal that lured Amazon to New York. Then de Blasio and his administration were ripped for being unprepared when a not very big snowstorm led to a commuter nightmare. But wait, there's more. After the mayor fired his investigation commissioner, Mark Peters, Mr. Peters fired back, charging de Blasio tried to quash investigations and reports that might embarrass the mayor. De Blasio denied that. So as far as the mayor goes, we have to pose the immortal question that former Mayor Koch always asked, how's he doing? Let's ask Ozzie Pabera, who writes the New York Today newsletter for the New York Times, and David Goodman, who covers City Hall for the Times. How is he doing at the end of this month?
I think he would give himself a passing grade, but not a great grade. But
he'd be that frank about his position?
I think he wasn't expecting the kind of criticism he got, but he sometimes seems like a person. Well, he's often said that he's underappreciated, and I think this week is no different in his own assessment.
Like any mayor. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to the mayor about the Amazon deal. He's very defensive, in part because this is something that progressives have really come out and attacked, and he's fashioned himself as a national model for progressivism. But there's a lot of folks that I was hearing from, especially not just in New York City, but outside, who were really sort of appalled by the look of the deal. And there's a lot of aspects of the deal that are good for New York City, and bringing jobs, the fact that there aren't actually tax expenditures that wouldn't have been done otherwise. These are kind of things that are available to any company. But still, giving all this sort of city largesse and state largesse to a multinational company that has trillions or billions of dollars at its disposal looked really bad. And so you had Senator Kirsten Gillibrand coming out and attacking it. You had even Bernie Sanders saying it didn't look very good. And the mayor is going up to hang out with Bernie tomorrow. And so he's trying to sort of extend beyond New York City, but in the things that he's doing in the city, it hasn't really showcased his leadership ability, at least in these last few weeks.
It didn't look good, but is it in fact bad? I mean, I remember the days when companies were fleeing New York. This is something that obviously is going to create a lot of jobs, many of those jobs not high-tech, high-paid jobs. Yeah. Isn't it better than it is worse, or not?
That's what you hear from business groups and even some people that would attack it. It's interesting, there's a lot of opposition in Queens, but when you step outside Queens, people aren't really talking about it. It's not a huge, on the public advocate trail, people are kind of making noise about it. But at the end of the day, it seems like it can both be true that maybe the city and the state overspent to get Amazon to come, and that it's still a good deal to have them come to New York City. The alternative would be that you don't have 25,000 to 40,000 jobs in this area of the city, and you try to find those jobs somewhere else. And the city's very good at making jobs, and we probably could have done it, but this is sort of a one-shot way of getting at that.
What about the relationship between the mayor and the governor? There was certainly a thaw in their relationship over this deal. Is that going to last, or is that a transactional thaw?
I would imagine that it's more of a transactional thaw, although the First Lady, the governor's girlfriend, had some very nice words for Bill de Blasio in a recent profile. But these two very much have tried to put behind them the idea of the feud and work when they can together. But outside of very specific projects, they don't seem to want to hang out with each other.
No, I mean, even
They're too much like each other, aren't they?
That's right. They know each other too well. I mean, that's something that they've both said before, is that they know each other very well, and so they're very comfortable attacking each other in public, which I don't know if that's a great explanation. If you're good friends.
Isn't that self-hate? I mean, I don't want to try to analyze it, but...
Yeah, it might be. I mean, and it was interesting when Sandra Lee, her sort of nice comment about the mayor was that she can stand near him, and he's not so bad to be near. But that's not glowing praise. She can be at a dinner party or a cocktail party and not walk away from him. That's her praise.
That's the best she can do, huh? What about the firing of the investigation commissioner? This is a mayor who, if you've written, doesn't fire anybody, even when he probably should. Now he fires what looks like a Saturday night massacre, his own investigation commissioner, who is supposed to be independent of the mayor.
Right. I mean, it's a little bit like the Amazon deal. I mean, the parallels are not exact, obviously, but this is an event that is, on its face, doesn't look so great, but this is also a person who was quite hated throughout city government. And there's a lot of people that will speak ill of Mark Peters when you talk to them, not for attribution, even some for attribution. And there's, when the mayor fired him, he didn't have a lot of people speaking up for him, and that sort of signals that he didn't have a lot of friends in the city. He also overstepped his bounds, and there was a report that showed how he did that with, a school investigatory agency that I think most people hadn't heard of before all this came about. So the firing was sort of justified on some level, and he kind of was able to do it because this is a person who had few friends left.
And very similar to the Amazon deal, the optics sort of give people an ability to sort of crystallize in their mind a criticism that they've had of deBlasio. The optics of the guy who ran for mayor arguing that he's going to fix A Tale of Two Cities, putting one of the richest companies in the world next to, in Long Island City, nearby one of the largest housing projects, sort of speaks to how the Tale of Two Cities still exists. Firing the person who's supposed to be an independent investigator, we're seeing shades of this in Washington. Obviously, very different details and very different people involved in that. But the idea that progressives and Democrats are sort of grappling with this kind of issue nationally, when they see something that looks parallel at home, it is hard to sort of get away from that kind of comparison.
And quickly, speaking of optics, what about the snow? The snow did in John Lindsay in 1969. Snow can, hard to predict the weather for anyone, but was the city unprepared for this one?
I do want to speak up for the mayor on this one.
Okay,
Because
go ahead. That's fair.
There's two things that I was thinking. So I'd actually been looking at the management reports, and the mayor has done a lot to proactively go after snow. He's very concerned because he had a snowstorm that sort of crippled traffic right in the beginning, and so he's been very aware of this. He puts a ton of salt on the street, like way more than he probably needs to. They got a little flat-footed on this one because the weather situation was just so unique, and so once the snow started falling, and the cars are already on the road, it's actually almost impossible to plow and keep up with the fast falling snow that it was. And it was quite unique. I mean, I don't know if I've ever seen a snow that was that heavy that early, and you're walking around the city and there are trees falling over. I mean, that's rare.
Right.
All right, so you want to cut them a little slack on
Right, and remember, a lot of these weather predictions come from the National Weather Service, and if they are giving you a certain kind of information or indication, every other predictor is going to sort of fall along those lines. So you sort of can't blame the quarterback when they're getting a readout of a certain play, and then all of a sudden it changes midway. So it's difficult for him, but the business of predicting weather is very complicated.
Okay, we'll watch for the next one. Ozzie Pebara, David Goodman of the New York Times. Coming up next, fire and fury over immigration and border security, a hot issue for President Trump and his base. Maybe room for compromise in the new Congress. Three interesting and thought-provoking developments in just the last week in the volatile debate over immigration and border security. U.S. border agents used tear gas against migrants at the Mexican border, including women and children who were rushing the border trying to get into the U.S. Second, President Trump, in interviews and in a meeting with GOP leadership, threatened a government shutdown if a spending bill doesn't include at least $5 billion for his proposed wall. And third, the Pew Research Center reports that the number of illegal immigrants in the U.S. fell to the lowest level in more than a decade in 2016, the last year for government data. So illegal immigration cools down while the fight over immigration heats up. What's going on? Where do we go from here? What would a compromise deal in the new Congress look like? Let's ask Eleanor Randolph and Clyde Haberman, both contributing writers at the New York Times. Is there a possible deal in the works? And we were talking about optics before regarding Mayor deBlasio. What about the optics of this, and how does this play in the country and perhaps more importantly around the world?
That one photograph of the mother with the 2 children, one of the children was still in diapers, and you could see the canister of tear gas just starting to erupt behind her. It was just disgusting. It almost made you ill to look at it. And to think that our troops and our people are actually doing that, I can't help thinking that people of good conscience will begin to say, look, you know, there's got to be a reasonable way to do this. They've got to be laws. You know, we've got to have, I think it was Tom Friedman is always talking about a high wall with a big door. And so, but, you know, there's got to be a system so that you do allow refugees to come in on a methodical basis. And, you know, the other thing that really got me is that it may be illegal for us, for our troops, to throw these canisters of tear gas into another country. I mean, there's a treaty that says you can actually use tear gas on your own people, and you know, if your kids are rioting or something like that, you can do that. But you're not supposed to use it on people outside your country.
Okay, let me, as usual, play devil's advocate and say these people were theoretically storming the border illegally, trying to get into the country without the legal right to do so. So if tear gas isn't the way to stop them, how do you?
Well, first of all, anybody has absolute legal right under international law to seek asylum. It doesn't mean that this country or any country has to accept them. Mm-hmm. But the notion of the right to seek asylum, if you feel you have a case of that you can really prove a serious threat to your life and limb back home, is just grounded in international law. So this whole business of these are all illegal people is by definition nonsense. They're illegal. Yes, you don't want people charging the border in that kind of way, but it's more than just the optics that look bad. It was bad, and I can't believe that soldiers want to be doing this kind of police action. First of all, they're not allowed to do this kind of policing within U.S. territory. There is the so-called Posse Comitatus Act of, I think, 1868, which says, no, you don't do policing here in this country. And
but you're allowed to throw the stuff into some other country.
Well, but again, Eleanor's quite right in saying that that this may indeed be an international human rights violation. On top of that, the last figure that you gave is the core one. The number of illegal or undocumented, to use the preferred term, undocumented foreigners in this country has been going down. Now, the man in the White House keeps throwing out numbers because he's constitutionally incapable of telling anything accurately, says that there are 30 million in this country. That is nonsense. The figure is 10.7 million, and as last we know, it's probably still going down further. It was an election year ploy. He dropped it almost immediately on November 6th, and but it's the use of our forces in this way that it is a deterioration of norms.
And it's also a diversion from other things we probably ought to be focusing on.
Absolutely.
So how do you get it out of the way? How do you get Congress to somehow deal with it, put it aside so we can move on to lots of other problems that we're facing?
Well, you know, I mean, look, you know, when George W. Bush was president, he and Kennedy and McCain, they started working on an immigration bill that, you know, it's still up there, it's still down there in Congress somewhere, and it was a really good start. Why can't Trump declare victory and say, okay, look, there are fewer immigrants, we've closed the wall, now let's set up a system that works and that makes it makes it methodical and legal, and we don't have people storming.
But in a
borders.
way, as Clyde says, why should he if politically this is a good issue to harp on?
Well, it wasn't all that good. After all, he did lose. Democrats gained about 40 seats in the House this time around. And also, he's the guy who was promising infrastructure, and so far as I could tell, the only thing that he cares about is this wall. He met with Governor Cuomo this week and gave no promise of what is desperately needed, this Gateway Tunnel project. People keep warning that the existing tunnels are in mortal peril, not helped by the salt waters of Hurricane Sandy. But so that's what should be focused on. For a New Yorker, we finally got a New Yorker in the White House, first one really since FDR, and he's done nothing.
But the president says the governor likes him.
Yeah, well, that's nice. I'm pretty
What a
sure
duo.
I'm pretty sure that's not true, and if he believes it, then it's just more proof that if you say something nice to him, he'll do whatever you want.
Thanks to Clyde Haberman. Eleanor Randolph. Up next, you'll meet the author of a big, beautiful book about New York. It's on the list of gift books for the holiday season in the metropolitan section of this week's Times. New York is the most global of cities. It's also a city with a unique and indelible personality of its own, and an extraordinary history to go along with that. Plenty of books have been written about New York, but a brand new one may top them all. It's called New York by New York. It's chock full of fascinating stories about the city, its history, along with stunning and iconic photographs. Published by Assouline, and an author, Wendell Jameson, is here to tell us about it. He's the former metropolitan editor of the New York Times, and it's got photographs by everyone from Edward Steichen, Ouija. It has text by E.B. White and Edith Wharton, Tom Wolfe. And this is a massive book. It weighs, I think, 11 pounds. Is that right?
It weighs more than that.
Even more. It felt like more than that.
When you've carried it a few blocks, you definitely feel that.
Good aerobic training, if nothing else. Wendell, in the course of writing this book, and you're someone who knew so much about New York, did you learn anything new?
Did I learn anything new? Yes, I learned some interesting things that I had not known about how it was terrible for many immigrants, especially Chinese immigrants here, when they first came at the beginning part of the century. And I also learned more about the fiscal crisis in the 70s, which was more your era than mine. But Martine Assouline, the publisher, moved to New York some years ago from Paris and wanted to do a book about this city that she's her adopted home. And so it was her idea. And we wanted to try and find a balance between most of these beautiful books that Assouline does that are very beautifully made books about art, that was also beautiful but also gritty in its portrayal of New York. So I wanted to make sure that we had some of the bad stuff in there too. So I did learn some of the bad stuff.
It really is a balance that way. The foreword by Jay McInerney, and one of the things you say is New York is both permanent and fleeting. That's perhaps the greatest contradiction of all. You have covered New York, have been an editor in New York. How do you think it's changed? And you've lived in New York, obviously. How do you think it's changed in the time you've been here?
Well, that's a good question. It's changed, of course, remarkably since I first was born in 1966 in New York Hospital and moved to Park Slope with my family in 1970. Yet it's still New York. It doesn't really look the same in many places. You know, as you walk the city today, you look at Hudson Yards and all of the pencil-thin skyscrapers going up everywhere. The city is changing remarkably around us, more so physically, I think, than at any time in my lifetime. Yet it's New York. Yet, you know, I reject, and when I was the Metro editor, I rejected this concept that New York is Disneyland, that it's been somehow cleaned up. It's not cleaned up. It has lots of problems. It has lots of grit, and that remains under the surface. So it's hard to describe. The energy is still here. The personalities are still here. You still hear plenty of curses when you listen to people walking down the street, yet all around.
In so many languages.
In so many languages. Well, I don't know all of them, but certainly in English I'm familiar with a lot of them. But at the same time, it's changing all the time. And that was what we sort of found in the book. Every era we talked about, whether it was For example, Prohibition, right? You would think this is a time where the city would shut down. In fact, it was one of the biggest parties in the history of New York. And then you jump forward to the 70s, where we had this incredible financial crisis, and you had literally dump trucks falling through the West Side Highway because no one had ever thought to maintain it. And yet you have one of the biggest parties in history at the discos, Studio 54 and Le Jardin, all the discos like that. So throughout this book, we kept finding these fun contradictions between the higher and the lower, the good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly of every era in New York history.
This is a massive book. It's also a massive city, a city of superlatives. How did you decide what to put in, and how did you decide what to leave out in terms of both photographs and text?
Well, when Martine first contacted me, we wanted to do 15,000 words, and I think it was 7 or 8 chapters. I think we did 30,000 words in 15 chapters.
Like any good writer.
Like any good writer. So it was really hard to leave stuff out, and I tried to get it all in there. But what we tried to do is pick moments. I mean, there was no way to tell the whole story of New York in the 20th century in 30,000 words. But if we picked a moment like Prohibition, like Jay McInerney writing Bright Lights, Big City in the 80s and talking about his experience and focused on that, or just a whole chapter about the Chelsea Hotel, we could tell those stories if we were very selective in them.
What do you want people to walk away with, other than perhaps a hernia from carrying this book?
Well, the beauty, and just I think it's the greatest city in the world. I've always felt that way. I wanted to be a journalist solely because I wanted to write about New York City. And I want them to take a part of it home with them if they're not from here. New York by New York, by the way. The idea is this is a book by New Yorkers for New Yorkers, and Martine is now a New Yorker, as I am, as you are. I had a little fun with it. I did sneak in little references to my lifetime experience growing up in New York. When I was little, my parents would bring us to Soho on Sundays, and we went to OK Harris, one of the first galleries down there, and so I mentioned families doing that. And in fact, my author picture is me as a child outside OK Harris. And so, I had personal fun with it too.
Do you think you're a different person because you grew up in New York?
I think
a
so.
lot
You
of
think I
people
talk fast
say,
enough?
well, we talk about, the fact that parents debate whether they should bring up their kids in the suburbs or whether it's cheap or whatever. What changed you as a person because you grew up in New York, do you think?
That's a good question. I was exposed to all kinds of people from all walks of life throughout my life, and am comfortable in all of those worlds. And same with my children. My children are very glad that we raised them in New York, and we sent our kids to public school. We did very well. We had great experiences with schools. We had a nice place to live. But it's the exposure to all these different worlds and all these different creeds and colors that have always surrounded me since I was little, and that I was surprised when I went to other parts of the country where life seems more segregated.
Gets you ready for the rest of the world.
That's right.
Wendell Jameson, New York by New York, one of the books I review in the bookshelf section of the Metropolitan section. I'll add my thoughts on Coda next. A front-page article in the Times this week reminded me of a conversation I had in the Middle East last summer. The article by Sabrina Tavernise reported on the backlash to Census Bureau projections that white Americans will become a minority of the nation's population within 25 years. Last July, I visited a slippery, dank cave in western Galilee near the Lebanese border. The cave was discovered by accident a couple of years ago when a bulldozer was digging a drainage ditch. Deep inside, some amateur archaeologists discovered a skull. Scientists said it was 55,000 years old, which would make it the oldest physical evidence we've got of when what we know now as humans migrated from Africa to Europe and Asia. Whose head was this? I asked Professor Israel Hershkovitz of Tel Aviv University. He retrieved a Tupperware container, one that his kids had used to carry their lunch into school. He opened it and handed me the ancient skull itself. It belonged to a woman, he said. Scientists even know that she was left-handed. I asked what race she would have been. The professor looked at me as if I had two heads. Black, of course, he replied. She came out of Africa, which was a bit of a wake-up call about how we define race today. 3 of Sally Hemings' children with Thomas Jefferson grew up to live as members of a white society. A century ago, the Irish were denigrated as, quote, Negroes turned inside out. Jews weren't welcomed as Caucasians until after World War II. Less than a century ago, a black man was acquitted of miscegenation because the woman he was consorting with was born in Sicily, which, an Alabama court ruled, can in no sense be taken as conclusive that she was therefore a white woman. We only began counting Hispanic people separately in 1970, when they demanded to be enumerated distinctly to reap the benefits of voting and civil rights laws. While we conflate color and race, keep in mind that the vast majority of people who self-identify as Hispanic also describe themselves as white, which means that white Americans will not become a minority anytime soon. That's why the census comes with a warning label that's worth repeating, quote, race and ethnicity are socio-political constructs and should not be interpreted as being scientific or anthropological in nature. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.